Hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study at Bridgeway Church. My name is Joel Eason. I serve as the senior pastor here at Bridgeway, and on behalf of our church family, welcome. I really do count it as a privilege to be connecting with you. Now, hey, today as we get into this study, hopefully you've been joining us along the way as we've been going through prophets in the summer of 2023. We went through the major prophets, and now in the fall of 2023, we're going through the minor prophets. And today we find ourselves all the way over with Habakkuk. And there's a variety of ways of saying that name. I'm just going to say it Habakkuk. If we look at kind of the original way to say it, then my enunciation of it is incorrect, but we're still going to stay with what is a little common for all of us. Now, let me just show you where we've been so far, and then we're going to jump straight into the talk. This is a fascinating book for us, and I think a very practical writing for us to look into. So far, we've gone through the introduction, and we've worked from Hosea all the way down to where we are today with Habakkuk, and we'll finish with four more, and then we will have closed out all of the minor prophets. And hopefully you have joined us for those, but if at any point you've missed one, we'd love to have you go back and listen to them. As I'm presently recording this, Israel and the war with Gaza area and Hezbollah up in Lebanon, and all of that is escalating, and it's been interesting for me as those things have developed to know and watch what's happening in that part of the world, which is heartbreaking, but also connected to biblical territories and to territories and animosity and tensions that a number of these prophets that you see identified dealt with even in their day with other people groups in the same regions. And it has been fascinating to me to know that the Lord had led us to this study, knowing sovereignly what would unfold. And so for me, it's been just kind of an amazing thing to consider the words of the prophets amidst all that is transpiring. And I think Habakkuk relates to that as well. And, straight out of the gate in chapter 1, some things we'll see that I think relate to a question that a lot of people have when they watch war and the complexities that are involved with that. So we'll get to that in just a second. But before we do so, I want to bring you kind of speed on some considerations. I'm going to give you 4 considerations regarding our series, regarding a study of major prophets, minor prophets. And because once again, on the major prophets, we dealt with Samuel, who is the first prophet. He's not a writing prophet in the way that Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are, but he is the start of the prophets. And then you have Elijah, you have Elisha, and then you get into the writing prophets, which are those major ones of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Historically, Daniel was not originally classified as one of the major prophets, but that's, we dealt with that when we did our study of Daniel. And then you get into these minor prophets. But the considerations that I'm going to show you, if you will recognize these considerations that I'm going to show you and you file it away, you get them embedded, you know them, you can talk with people about them, then you would be, I'm going to make up a number, but I don't think I'm too far off. I think you're up in the top 5% of Old Testament Bible students. Because when we have people who take the Old Testament, we might know some things about Abraham and we might know some things about Moses and David, but there's a large chunk of the Old Testament that is the prophets. And when it comes to the prophets, most folks don't know even a starting point with them, and just kind of say, well, that was for a past time, past people, doesn't affect me. if you understand these considerations that I'm going to show you, I would place you in a top 5% of people within churches around being a Bible student. So, here are those four considerations. Number one is to remember that the study of prophets is also a study of the kings. So when you deal with Isaiah, you know he's prophesying amongst kings. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. That's Isaiah chapter 6. And then there's four kings that he prophesies in the era of. We know that Jeremiah prophesied in an era of kings. We know that Samuel deals with King Saul, King David. We know that Elisha and Elijah both were dealing with king problems. So there was wickedness in the nation, and because there was wickedness that came about because of kings, God raised up prophets. So if you understand that the study of the prophets is also a study of kings, then you are far ahead of a lot of people when it comes to understanding those portions of the Old Testament. The second thing that I would say is that the Israelites were separated into two categories of people. So understanding you had a united kingdom with King Saul, King David, King Solomon. Following that, you have a fractured, splintered, divided kingdom, and it's in that era of division that the writing prophets and the minor prophets come to the forefront. And the northern portion of Israel was classified as Israel, and the southern portion classified as Judah. Inside of that, you may remember that in the southern portion, their capital area would have been Jerusalem. The northern tribes of Israel made around Shechem or Shechem, that area of Samaria. They made that their central location. Jeroboam had put in a temple there, so it started a lot of worship. That's where we get the John chapter 4. Jacob's well is in that very town. Jacob's well, and the woman says to Jesus, "You say that we should worship in Jerusalem, but my people worship here." That's coming from the divided kingdom. And inside of that, you have different kings at different eras. So you had the northern people, the northern tribes, were dealing with certain opposition at certain points, and then the southern territory was dealing with certain opposition. And so when I say that, consideration number 3 kind of pulls off of that. Typically, there was a prevailing and oppressing world empire at the given time. So when we have those 10 tribes in the north, Israel, and you have kings that are doing wicked, and so God raises up a prophet, or there are southern area and kings are allowing the devaluing of the temple, devaluing of the law, and God raises up a prophet there. You typically had a world empire that was oppressing them. So let me show you that. And this is a great one to remember, maybe even take a snapshot of it. And that was that the northern tribes, the dominant oppressor for them was Assyria. That's where Joel is going to prophesy against in the city of Nineveh. That's where Nahum is going to prophesy of their destruction. And then you have a time range. So there's history around this. And then you have in the southern territories, you had the dominant oppressor would be Babylon. And you would have in the time period of the 600s. And when you see 7 up in Israel, 722 BC, if you just remember Assyrian captivity, when Assyria took captive the northern tribes, dismantled them, and all that you'll even hear today where people say that Israel, began to no longer operate as a kingdom. You're going back to 722 BC of that fracturing, that first deportation, so to say. And then you jump down to the Babylonian captivity of 586 BC, and the very famous one would be Nebuchadnezzar, who's leading Babylon, which we're going to he shows up in our study of Habakkuk. But you would have the main prophets of that period would be Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. Remember, Jeremiah is in Jerusalem when the captivity is happening, and that's where you get the book of Lamentations. Ezekiel and Daniel are both exiled out of Jerusalem, and they're going to prophesy in the midst of that. And then following Habakkuk, we're going to see some what are called post-exile prophets. So as Babylon falls and the Persians become the world empire that's ruling, and the Jewish people are allowed to return to Jerusalem, that's where you're going to end up with your story around Zerubbabel. You're going to have Ezra. You're going to have Nehemiah. You're going to have Haggai. You're going to have those names showing up post-exile. But if you remember this portion, you're way ahead of most students or people that entertain the Old Testament. Last thing that I would give you is that number 4 is that almost all the prophets are pronouncing warnings and judgments towards a group of people. And so in the backdrop of what we just saw, they're giving a pronouncement against either a king. For instance, you have Elijah who is pronouncing against Ahab. You have Isaiah who is pronouncing against Ahaz. You have pronouncements that are going maybe against a kingdom. You have Nahum who is pronouncing against the kingdom of Assyria. You have the minor prophets prophesying against Edom, which was in the southern portion of the Dead Sea. So you have the prophets who are prophesying against someone or something. Now that's going to bring us to today's study, and a summary of Habakkuk is because the book of Habakkuk is not him prophesying to any particular group of people. It's very unique. He is not prophesying to a group of people, and he is not prophesying to a nation. The book of Habakkuk is a conversation, a dialogue between this one guy and God. And it involves Babylon, and it involves Nebuchadnezzar, but it is a dialogue between Habakkuk and God. So let me show you a summary of the chapters, and then we're going to walk through some things. The first chapter is going to be his questions to God. Why? Why, God, is all this happening? If you've ever asked God, why do you let evil happen? Then Habakkuk chapter 1 is for you. And how does God respond to that? Why did God let that happen to our family? Why did God let that happen in the world? When I'm watching all the despair in the world and the hostility and the war, God, why aren't you doing something? That's the very question that Habakkuk has. Chapter 2, he's going to move to, we're supposed to live by faith. So from that question, we're going to move to God's going to answer him, and God's going to call him and hold him accountable to live by faith. And then chapter 3 is going to be a song or a prayer of trust, where Habakkuk says, I trust you, Lord. Now, if we were to put a timeline around this, we're going to see the Babylonians in this. We can kind of date this. Most scholars will date this, happening before the 600 sometime, because we know that the Battle of Nineveh, I talked about this in our study of Nahum, the Battle of Nineveh happens in 612, and this Habakkuk would have happened before the domination, I'll use that word, the domination of Babylon over the Assyrians. So the exact dating of it isn't really going to be critical for us, but if you wanted to study kind of the time range, that would be when. So let's look at a couple of things. So we have in chapter 1, verse 1, we have the oracle that Habakkuk, the prophet, received. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? So when you see his name, as you can see up there on your screen, his name simply means embrace. If we were to just talk about Habakkuk, that's all we have from him. We're not going to find him as a person elsewhere. and we don't really know of his geography. We don't know things about him other than the name, meaning embrace. But it's interesting that he uses this word violence, and it's the Hebrew word for Hamas. And that's a pressing reality for us given what we're watching right now with Israel and Hamas out of Gaza area. And, we're hearing all kinds of things. And I'm not going to make this political. At the same time, our media can be very biased and not in a way that favors Scripture by any means. And so, there's a lot of hostility that gets directed at Israel, and I'll just say unapologetically that we stand, on the side of Israel. Now, does that mean that everything Israel does is right? I'm not suggesting that at all. But God is still in covenant with the people there, and I could make this into a very long dialogue around that, and I don't want to. I just simply will say the roots of Hamas come all the way back to a Hebrew word of violence, and so I find that to be interesting. But to keep us on target to the study, let's look at what Habakkuk questions. He questions God, why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Now stop there. You could stop right there and say, I've asked some of those questions. I watch it at work. I watch it with kids. I watch a kid who grows up with a sickness. I watch a family go through, turmoil. I watch somebody lose somebody what feels like prematurely. Why do you tolerate what's wrong in the world? And that's a pressing question. And Habakkuk is asking God that. He says, destruction and violence are before me. There's strife. Conflict abounds. And his parallel to that then is that therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked him and the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Now, what is he talking about with that statement about the law is paralyzed or justice never prevails? He's pushing entirely on the law of Moses. They didn't have any other law that was the mandate or the standard. It was the law of Moses. And the law of Moses was very clear about blessings and curses, about promises to obedience, and also promises to what happened from disobedience. And when you watch evil happen and there is a curse that happens or a consequence that happens, compare that to where you see a righteous act happen or you see justice happen and there's a blessing there, then there's a governing that happens from the outcomes. But when God isn't presenting outcomes and evil goes uncontested, unmitigated, when blessings or righteousness is not rewarded, then you end up with evil and you end up with wickedness and chaos. And so that's why Habakkuk is saying, from his perspective, the law and its authority and the promises of results, it feels like it's paralyzed. And justice doesn't seem to be prevailing. And God, why are you watching that and not doing something about it? He continues with this accusation. You don't listen. You don't say justice, doesn't prevail. And he also is making it very personal. Why are you making me watch it? Like, why can't I do anything about it? Why are we in this? And God's going to answer him. So before we look at God's answer, I want you to know this is important how God answers, because it lets you and me know that if we question something about God, he does not hit us. He doesn't berate us. He actually often will enter the dialogue with us. Now, he is going to enter not as, yeah, you're right. He's going to enter with his sovereignty and his supremacy. And that's exactly what happens in Habakkuk. God enters the dialogue around his sovereignty and his supremacy over all things. So let's look into it. God answers and says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I'm raising up the Babylonians. Pause. You might have a translation that says the Chaldeans, same group of people. I'm raising up the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. And we know that Nebuchadnezzar was that primary initial emperor, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. And it says, verse 7, they are feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their honor. Their horses, and he's just talking about their military, their horses, swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong, their horsemen come from afar. They fly like vultures swooping to devour. He's just depicting their army is different, more powerful, faster than what other people have seen. They all come bent on violence, Hamas. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. So it's just simply they come in so fast, and the number of their victims are almost countless. And so it's interesting to me that as God is entering the dialogue, he is telling Habakkuk, I'm going to answer some things, but I want you to know I'm raising somebody up, and it's actually going to get worse. He is showing his sovereignty, not by, oh, you're right, let me pull it back under control. God has never lost control. Hear that in your life. If you have evil happening in your life, and you're like, why is that happening? He has never lost control. And he is telling Habakkuk, I'm raising up one that it's actually going to get worse, but I have not lost control in this situation. Now I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but Habakkuk's going to follow with another question. You can read the details. The verses that we're skipping are just more verses on the nature of Babylon, how fierce they are, how fast they are, all those kinds of things. Habakkuk comes back with verse 13, and he says, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Like, man, I really honestly don't know a person that hasn't questioned that same category. God, why do you tolerate wickedness and evil? God, why are you silent when bad things happen? Why do you allow wicked people to advance on righteous people? It feels like you've lost control. And he's going to have some more things to say. He's going to finish. He bleeds into chapter 2. He says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. Now, at this point, you might think that God is just going to say, he's going to flick him, say, get out of my way, you wicked, sinful person. But God engages him, and he's gentle towards him, but he's not gentle in the way of dumbing down his nature. He is going to continue to uplift his supremacy. And what follows in God's answer to this continued question is probably the most famous verse in Habakkuk. It says, then the Lord replied, write down the revelation, make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It is coming, but it has an appointed time. In our Sundays, we've been in the series Cooking with a Cold, and if you haven't been a part of that, I won't take this time to explain the concept. It's a metaphor. But we're leaning into Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. Let us not be weary in well-doing, for at the proper time we'll reap a harvest if we faint not, if we don't give up at the appointed time. There's so much of what God does that has an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. Once again, Galatians 6, 9. That we will reap a harvest. At the appointed time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up, if we faint not. And same concept here. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, he is puffed up. His desires are not upright. This is pointing to Nebuchadnezzar. But the righteous will live by his faith. And he's actually going to push on Nebuchadnezzar in a moment. But let's talk about this for a second, because I do think that this is important. Because God has said that it's going to get difficult, it's actually going to get more difficult. And then he says, write down the revelation. So let's think about that, because that's a famous verse. I bet you've heard it. What is the revelation? Like when it says, write down the revelation, what is the revelation? You study the book of Habakkuk, and there is no defined statement that is the quote-unquote revelation. The revelation is not that more evil is coming. The revelation is that while more evil might come, God is still in control. God is sovereign and supreme, and he is going to continue to push that. So sometimes in our life we can see evil or hardships coming, and we can feel like this can be a hard season. And the concept of write down the vision, write down the revelation so that anybody can run with it, hold on to it, is the idea that God has not lost control at all in this situation. So I'm able to rest and trust, and then ultimately, last verse that you see there, walk by faith. Hear me and hear me clear. God still holds us responsible to be righteous and to follow him with faith, independent of circumstances, not predicated by good or bad. He calls us to follow him and trust him and walk by faith amidst all things. And the vision here to Habakkuk is that while it might get dark, I am still in control, and you can still walk by faith. Now, when you see that righteous will live by faith, that's going to show up a couple of times. It'll show up in Romans chapter 1. It'll show up in Galatians chapter 3. It'll show up in Hebrews chapter 10. But I hope for you and I that we pull so far from Habakkuk that we can talk to God about what we see. And if we are burdened and bothered by evil, that's because maybe our heart is more like his heart. But the accusation is not that God is silent or out of control. We can talk to him about it, but he will answer us that he is still in control. He is still worthy, and we can still continue to walk by faith. But I love the fact that we can come to God and we can talk about what we feel. Now, from that, he's going to go back to pointing to Babylon, chapter 2. He's going to point towards Babylon, specifically at its leader. We know that's Nebuchadnezzar from history. So I'll just show you a few snapshots. He is arrogant, and Babylon is captured by its leader, and its leader is captured by its people. Same kind of thing to our whole series, that if you're studying the prophets, you study the king. As the king went, so went the nation. Same thing for Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. He's arrogant, never at rest. He's as greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and takes captives all the peoples. We'll jump to verse 8. Because you have plundered many nations, the peoples who are left will plunder you. He's talking about his eventual demise. I'll say a couple words on that in a second. For you've shed man's blood, you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. You've plotted the ruin of many people, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. Now let me just leave that up and say a couple things there. So remember, over in chapter 1, God is telling Habakkuk, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. Here, chapter 2, God's already advancing forward and talking about his demise. It's such a small window to God. It does not feel like a small window to people. It does not feel like a small window in history. But it is a small window to the Lord. He holds all those things in the palm of his hand. Now, we read about the demise of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. Daniel's going to talk about a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 2, and it is going to really bother Nebuchadnezzar. And then we also read about him in chapter 4 of Daniel, and kind of this period in which Nebuchadnezzar goes what would be medically defined as insane. He becomes highly schizophrenic, and I'm not using that word, without direction. He would be clinically schizophrenic. He becomes very incensed and paranoid, becomes a real trouble to himself. And you see the words of Habakkuk finding its fulfillment in his life. Now, from that, then God in Habakkuk God's going to talk about himself. And he's going to say in verse 14, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." And I'm going to leapfrog a couple of things. But he says in 16, "You'll be filled with shame instead of glory," talking to Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon and all those nations. "Now it is your turn. Drink and be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you've done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you, for you've shed men's blood, you've destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them." And then God talks about the valuing of idols. So, and we could talk a long time about idolatry, that a study of the prophets is a study of the kings, and typically the kings allowed for three different things. If you'll remember in our study, they said idolatry, and idolatry led to injustice, and injustice led to immorality. Those three things are in most kings' scenarios in which a prophet is raised up. They had idolatry, and that led to a high level of injustice amongst the people, and the injustice allowed for the rich and for the wealthy and the haves to have high levels of immorality, even within the temple, and with not obeying the law of Moses. And so Habakkuk is leaning on the inadequacy of idols. And verse 19, "Woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold or silver. There's no breath in it." This is God talking. "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him." So follow me so far, and then we're going to start heading to the landing. Number one, Habakkuk is seeing evil in the world, in his world, and beyond that world. And he's saying, "God, why?" And God is saying, I've not lost control. It's actually going to get worse for a period. Habakkuk counters and says, "I don't understand this. You have holy, pure eyes. How are you allowing this? Why are you allowing this? I sit here and wait." And God is going to define some things about Nebuchadnezzar and evil that persists and takes advantage. And then he's going to talk about the inadequacy of idols, and that he is in the temple, and that he's still calling and holding Habakkuk and his people to live righteous lives, to live by faith, to trust. So from that to chapter 3, then chapter 3 becomes a kind of a surrender, a prayer that is set to music. And we know that because of the very last verse in Habakkuk is going to be directed to musicians. So it says, "A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet." And where you see this word Shigionoth, I don't even know how to pronounce it. I didn't really look into that. What I do know about that word is that no one really has a definition of it. I've read commentaries on it. And no one has a description of what that word really means. The assumption is that it's a passion-based kind of exclamation kind of thing, and that it could be used in music, was not restricted to music, but it's a motive. It's an emotive thing. So this is a passionate prayer, so to say. And then I'm going to let you read it. He goes into a lot of elements talking about God, and he is going to rehearse things about the attributes of God and what God has done in the past. I'm not going to show those to you, but he talks about what God has done in the past and the character of God. What I do want you to see is how he lands the prayer, how he lands this song of worship. This is how the book of Habakkuk comes to a close. Remember, an emotive, passionate prayer song, and he says, "Though the fig tree does not bud, there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crops fail, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stall, yet I'll rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior." He says, even if nothing changes, I've asked my questions. I've lobbied my complaints to the Lord. God has answered on his own character, his own supremacy, his own sovereignty, that he's in control. He's called me to live by faith. He's called us all to live by faith, to write down the revelation that he is in control. And so even if my fig tree does not bud, even if for Israel there are no grapes or the olive crop fails, even if nothing changes right now, I will rejoice in the Lord. And that is a powerful statement. That verse is a powerful statement for all of us. If nothing changes, if God chooses not to say yes to our prayer, if God chooses not to answer our questions, if God chooses not to move the needle one bit or allows it to even go worse, yet I will praise and rejoice. I will worship. I will trust. And he finishes with this statement. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. And then we know it's a musical thing for the director of music on my stringed instruments. Last thing I'll say is look at what he focuses on. Earlier, at the beginning, God, there's injustice in our people within our walls. God, there's evil and treachery outside in the world. And he finishes by saying all of that from this dialogue. The Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer, where I can be on cliffs and be stable. He enables me to go on the heights. I pray that that's true for you as well. I want you to know that in the writing of Habakkuk, that there's this invitation to come to the Lord and have an honest dialogue with him. He's not afraid and he's not alarmed by what you have to say and what you question. He'll engage that, but he won't dip down to our level. He still maintains his sovereignty and supremacy, and he causes us to lift up our eyes to him. And he still calls us to live by trust and by faith and to walk in righteousness, because he is still sovereign and he is still in control. And from that we can pull away and say, though the world be raging and though the things around me are in turmoil, he is my strength and he enables me to go on the heights. And I pray that the Lord would strengthen you as well as we've studied the book of Habakkuk. I look forward to having you for our next study. And with that, God bless you, and I'll see you very soon.